So today I'll be talking about 8 timeless lessons I learned from the book Black Swan. So I'm starting a new series where I'll be distilling my favourite ideas from my favourite books on all things around lessons on epistemology when applied to investing. So I'll be breaking this video down into 3 parts. Number 1 is fallacies when forecasting the future. Number 2 is about how we can get closer to the truth. And number 3 is about how black swans have the potential to ruin us, but also have the potential to make us hugely rich if we know how to leverage them. So the first key idea of this book is that this whole notion of trying to predict the future is basically a fool's game. And a lot of people instinctively think that you have to do this. You have to, when it comes to investing, that you have to either have to predict what certain events are going to happen, or more particularly what the price is going to do, whether the price is going to go up or down when you invest. But this is actually not the case. And the book talks about how usually when people try to forecast the future or think about risk, they fall for this thing called the ludic fallacy. So the word ludic comes from the word ludus in Latin, which means game. So it just means that when people think about uncertainty, risk, probability, the future, they think about very standardized games like roulette or dice and things like this. But these games, what he argues is that they do not represent reality whatsoever. He calls these basically domesticated and sanitized risk, where all of the possible outcomes are there and you know the probabilities beforehand. Whereas in real life, you don't actually know the probabilities of anything happening at all. It's not obvious what the probabilities are. But it's not even only just this. He goes one step further. Whereas in games like roulette, all of the possible outcomes are very clear. There are 37 possible outcomes from 0 to 36. You know for a fact it's going to land on any one of those things. But it's not the case in real life. You don't even know what all of the possible outcomes are. So in the roulette example, you know for a fact it wouldn't land on 99, for example. Whereas in real life, you can be completely blindsided by something that's happened that completely wasn't even in your entire remit. And a cool example he gives is actually using the management of 4 casinos. So obviously with management for casinos, they're obsessed with profits, and they would spend literally hundreds of millions on game theory and all of these things, but where they were obsessed with not losing money to any of the gamblers over the table. And they would invest literally millions and millions on state-of-the-art surveillance systems, which would make the most high-secure bank look very pedestrian by comparison. But actually, in reality, in this particular example, he was saying the casinos basically lost the most money from causes that they didn't even envision in the first place. For example, one of their star performers got mauled by a tiger, and they had to cancel all of their shows, and it lost tens and tens of millions from this. And then another example of an employee basically not filing their IRS tax return forms and costing them millions and millions. And it all led to huge losses. So basically what Nassim Taleb is saying is that we are blind to the future, and trying to predict or forecast what's going to happen is basically a fool's errand. But because it's basically impossible to calculate the probabilities of these high impact events, Taleb is saying basically we should not try to predict what's going to happen whatsoever. Instead, we should try to protect ourselves from a wide range of possibilities. So number 2 follows on from this fallacy of making predictions, where after we've made a prediction and it turns out to be wrong, we have this little quirk in our brain that uses hindsight bias to try and make sense of the prediction. Basically, we try and make sense of events after the fact to make it all seem more coherent. But he says that basically once we have hindsight, we move the goalposts and we convince ourselves we were playing a different game in the first place. But the example he gave was that when people basically failed to predict the fall of the Soviet Empire, they basically blamed the Russians for hiding lots of key information from them, and that's why they weren't able to predict it. But actually, they really had a good understanding of Russian politics. It's only that really key important information was withheld from them. Experts are especially prone to this, because whereas taxi drivers, when you ask them about, for example, the stock market and they make a wrong prediction, they understand the limitations of their knowledge. Whereas with experts, every time they make a correct prediction, they attribute it to their own skill. Whereas if they make a wrong prediction, they blame the situation and then they spin a story to basically justify it. Actually, the whole premise of this is because our brains have a need to create a narrative, to make a story, to make sense of everything, we are basically prone to fooling ourselves. With hindsight bias, we think things make a lot more sense than they actually do, which gives us a false sense of security to keep going on and trying to make predictions and continuing to be wrong at the same rate. But crucially, the worst thing is we don't actually learn from it. So basically the lesson here is he warns that we should be very skeptical of looking at the past and being very skeptical that we don't use hindsight bias to make sense of events and look at things more objectively. So on the topic of fooling ourselves, he talks about this other quirk of our brain called the narrative fallacy. Basically, we have a need to tell a story or create a narrative between lots of different independent events to basically simplify things and make it easier for our brains to process and understand. We do this because reality is an extremely complex place with thousands and thousands of variables coming at us all at the same time. So we really have to condense it down and make sense of things. And it makes it easier for us to remember when everything's weaved in a straight line in a story where it's not A, B, and C. It's A happened because of B, because of C. So for example, if I make two separate statements, one is that Joe is happily married and Joe killed his wife. And then the second statement is Joey seemed happily married. He killed his wife to get her inheritance. So with the second statement, even though there's more information in it, people find it far easier to remember because it fits in terms of a narrative. And worryingly, if you ask people which one do you think is more likely, they'll say the second option, even though the second option is more specific because you're specifically saying Joey killed his wife because of the inheritance. Whereas the first statement, with the first two sentences, it includes killing the wife for inheritance and other things. So it's actually far more encompassing. But people think the second one is more likely just because it seems to form a coherent story in our minds. Even though the first one includes all possible motives. And this is actually a key weakness of our brain. We have a need to form a causal relationship between things, even if they are not related. Particularly dangerous in the financial world and what our brains are really not evolved to process, because there are literally thousands or tens of thousands that go into affecting what the stock market does. So as an example, for the S&P 500, if you read the news, if it has a big jump up or a big jump down, the news and the media, mainstream media, will have to assign some sort of cause to it. Oh, the president made a tweet here, or the S&P 500 dropped this much because of this, when there are literally thousands and thousands of variables that go into it, and it's kind of silly just to assign it to one thing. So basically the lesson he draws here is that we have to avoid this thinking called what he calls platonicity, which basically means assigning things artificially into very neat defined categories, when in reality things don't fit into very neatly defined categories, and it's way messier. But our brains actually don't like that. We have to find a causal relationship between things. We have to categorize things to fit neatly. Okay, so now we're moving on to part 2, which is getting closer to the truth. So lesson 4 is about how if we actually want to get closer to the truth, we need to seek disconfirming evidence. So a big fallacy of what people use to come up with theories, as an example, if they look at the S&P 500, if they want to know what risk it is, what it's likely to perform in the future, they'll look at the past and say, okay, by and large, it should do a similar thing into the future. And he compares that to the turkey example. So imagine if you put yourself in the position of a turkey, and then your theory is that humans put your well-being at their forefront, and that's just your theory to start off with. And then on the first day, a human starts feeding you, and then on the second day, they feed you again, and every successive day they feed you, that reinforces your point of view that humans put your well-being at the forefront. And the thing is, after 1,000 days, when you've seen 1,000 observations of humans feeding you at your most confident, and on the 1,001st day, an unexpected event happens. And this is what he argues against. We can't just use inductive knowledge. We can't just use past observations to make predictions about the future. And we have to seek what's called disconfirming evidence. And with disconfirming evidence, even one piece of disconfirming evidence can tell you far, far more than 1,000 pieces of confirming evidence. Another example is if your hypothesis is that all swans are white, even if you saw 1,000 white swans, that wouldn't conclusively prove it. Whereas if you saw just one black swan, that would disprove your theory. And this is exactly the case with investing in the markets and the S&P 500. We can't just look for confirming evidence. We have to look for disconfirming cases. And this sort of pattern exists in the financial markets, where sometimes when we feel at our most safe, when the stock market has done a certain thing for a very long time, that's when an unexpected reversal is probably most likely to happen. So lesson number 6 he talks about is that reality is actually far more extreme than what our brains are wired to kind of process and think about and understand. So he talks about the classical bell curve, which a lot of statisticians and a lot of mathematicians use that to model reality, when basically what he's saying, it's a really bad representation of reality. So what he does is he invents two terms. He invents the term mediocristan and extremistan. So what he means by mediocristan are certain variables that we think follow the bell curve. So let's just say, as an example, if you imagine the heaviest person you've come across in your entire life, he or she is probably twice or even 3 times the average person. The thing is, even if you take that person into a room with 1,000 existing people, if you put him into that room and you averaged it, he or she wouldn't really affect the average of the whole population. That's what a mediocristan variable is. But when it comes to extremistan variables, like wealth, for example, it doesn't follow that same pattern. So as an example, if you had the same 1,000 people in the room and you took their average net worth, and then Bill Gates or Elon Musk walk in by them, even if it's just one person, that would massively distort the average. And this is what it means by extremistan. It means that one variable, one extreme case, has the potential to massively alter the average. And basically what he argues is, as the modern world is becoming more and more complicated, it is becoming more extremistan, whereas our brains are only evolved to deal with mediocristan variables. It's becoming more and more extreme. Things like income, CEO incomes, wealth, market capitalization of companies, these all follow extremistan behavior, which cannot be modeled by the bell curve, by Gaussian methods, and it's not what our brains are kind of wired to process. So now we move on to part 3, where we talk about how black swans have the potential to make us rich. So point 7, he talks about, given that we now understand that the world is extremistan, how we should navigate it is we shouldn't think about the probabilities of certain events happening, because it's literally impossible to calculate all of the outcomes. We don't even know, firstly, what all of the possible outcomes are, let alone calculate their probabilities. So instead, we should actually think about the consequences of those events happening. So as an example, maybe we cannot predict the probability of an earthquake hitting San Francisco, but we can model very well what an earthquake of a certain power might do to San Francisco if it were to hit. So we've established that black swans can be hugely devastating. So black swan examples could be a war breaking out, a pandemic that no one saw, which can basically wipe out people's entire wealth. But there are actually positive black swans, and we can actually benefit from them. So positive black swans are things like movies, publishing, scientific research, content creation, entrepreneurship, and venture capital. The point of these are the majority of attempts will be failures, but they'll be very low cost attempts. But when it does take off, the rewards are basically uncapped. And again, we don't know the probabilities of these happening. If you're a venture capitalist investor, at the beginning, you don't know which one of your prospects are going to take off hugely. Or if you're a publisher, beforehand, you don't know exactly which one's going to be a multi-million bestseller. You might have an idea, but you don't know for sure. So you don't know the probabilities, but you can have a gauge of the entire consequences. The whole lesson about assessing black swans is think about the consequences rather than the probability. The final point is about taking lots of asymmetric bets. So since we don't know the probabilities, and like we said in lesson 1, we cannot predict the future, we don't know when the next big breakthrough is going to come. So he basically says we have to collect lots and lots of free non-lottery tickets. And the reason why he calls them non-lottery tickets is with a lottery ticket, the maximum reward is still capped, which is why he says non-lottery tickets, because in a proper black swan, the rewards are completely uncapped. Particularly as a general rule, which is his investment philosophy, and even in life, we want to take lots of asymmetric bets where the cost of entry is actually very, very low, but the rewards can be huge. And this means that we should seize every single opportunity that comes our way and try to maximize serendipitous encounters. So what he means by that is living in big cities, going to parties, because you never know who you bump into, who you will speak to, what sort of these encounters will lead to. So then the other thing he recommends is what he calls maximum tinkering, where you do lots and lots of trial and error and let positive accidents happen. So when I was reading this book, I just thought it was a really cool point when I first came across this, because even though this book came out in roughly 2007, this point is hyper relevant today, and it's similar to what Naval Ravikant says in his book. Basically, he talks about how, especially today with the rise of AI, things are changing faster than ever, and we have to basically keep redefining what we do until we become the best at it. So that's point 8. Take lots of asymmetric bets and maximize our exposure to positive black swans. So if you're interested in more distilled points like these on everything around epistemology and finance, another of my favorite realizations and ideas, I actually talk about this on a free weekly newsletter. Next video.